influenced political, social, and economic arenas throughout the world.
May God bless us and all who sail in us.
Prized as national symbols for their massive size, incredible speed, and elegant decor, they alone were responsible for the largest migration of people in history. Pinnacles of human achievement representing industrial and technological might, the great liners were to become pawns in the battle for global dominance.
Ships from the very beginning are symbolic of nations and peoples. Showing the flag, your ship is bigger than their ship, and so you have this constant race for size. So these are tremendous national symbols.
In their golden age, they captured the imagination of the public, igniting patriotic pride, just as the space race did 100 years later.
They're castles at sea, they're mechanical marvels, they're an embodiment of so much, and I don't think there's a soul who would look at a ship sailing by that would not be aroused in some way by the sight of that vessel.
The story of the ocean liner is an epic saga of one of the great icons of the industrial age, which shrank the world and became the vehicle of revolutionary global change. Once thought that the jet airliner would spell doom for passenger ships. But today, there are far more people traveling the oceans of the world than ever before. Extraordinary floating cities of up to 100,000 tons now routinely journey to the four corners of the globe, carrying thousands of passengers and crew. Behind the romance evoked by these great ships, there is a long and dramatic evolution, a story of visionaries and rival nations who pushed human ingenuity and technology to their limits in a great race for dominance of the sea. Throughout the 18th century, Britannia ruled the waves. With frail vessels of timber and canvas, she built and held together the greatest empire the world had seen. But her vital communication links with her colonies were totally dependent on the whimsies of wind and current.
Before the opening of the Suez Canal, you had to go around the Cape to get out to the Far East and out to Australia. With sailing vessels, you're talking of 5 to 8 months for round trips.
In the days of sail, passengers were often regarded as cargo. Their comfort and safety were less consequential to ship owners than their profitability.
And in the old pre-steam days, when you used to have sailing brigs, they were called coffin brigs, because they often never got there.
In 1,000 years, the evolution of ships had been painfully slow. But as the 18th century turned, that was all to change. By the 1820s, the driving force of the Industrial Revolution, steam, was successfully being adapted to ships. The first steamships were modest affairs, small, coal-burning paddle wheelers plying the coasts and rivers of Europe and North America. Crossing the Atlantic Ocean in a steamship was thought to be impossible. One skeptic considered it as achievable as voyaging from Liverpool to the moon. But in 1819, a converted New York sailing packet, the Savannah, made the crossing in 27.5 days, beginning a new chapter in maritime history. And there were other oceans to conquer. In 1829, Sophia Jane became the first ship ever to paddle sail halfway around the world from London to Sydney, Australia. In 20 remarkable years, steamships had come of age, inspiring a new breed of ship owners and designers. In 1837, Arthur Anderson and Brodie Wilcox, the founders of the P&O Line, pioneered a royal mail service between England and Spain with a small fleet of steamers. 3 years later, Samuel Cunard began the first scheduled mail service across the North Atlantic with Britannia. A mail subsidy from the British government paid for the ship. Passengers provided the profit.
And I took the trouble to read Cunard's mail contract. And passengers aren't mentioned in it anywhere. But they followed in his wake because his ships arrived safely.
By the late 1830s, steamships, with their promise of faster, more reliable passage, began to challenge sail for passenger trade to all corners of the globe. But the ships were small, and demand quickly exceeded the berths available. By the late 1830s, the visionary British engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel came up with a bold concept for a large, high-speed liner specifically built for transatlantic passenger service. Brunel's timber-hulled Great Western, launched in Bristol in 1837, was one of the biggest ships of her time, carrying up to 150 passengers. But it was Brunel's second creation, the Great Britain, which ushered in a new age, the era of the ocean liner. Brunel took a steam engine and the newly invented screw propeller and fitted them into an iron hull, creating the first truly ocean-going passenger liner. She made 32 round trips from Britain to Australia, making her by far the most traveled steamship of her time. The Great Britain could accommodate up to 360 passengers. Newspapers of the day reported with great enthusiasm on the laying of over 1,000 yards of best quality carpet and the installation of mirrors to increase the impression of space.
Part of the reasoning was to take people's minds away from the dangers in crossing the ocean at that early date, before wireless, before all of the fine points of naval architecture and stability were taken into account, as well as to help people take their mind off of seasickness and the inevitable pitching and rolling that came about, particularly on the North Atlantic.
The Great Britain survives today, restored in the Bristol dry dock, where she was constructed over a century and a half ago.
Really, it was the wonder of the age. It was the largest ship in the world. He laid the whole foundation for the modern ocean liner in that one design.
During the reign of Queen Victoria, reliable vessels like the Great Britain allowed the British Empire to more efficiently expand its territory and presence around the world. The construction of larger passenger ships was an enticing prospect to a queen eager to out-colonize her European rivals and fill British coffers.
Ah, Mr. Brunel, what are you designing now? Something we shall find amusing, I trust.
How about something 6 times bigger than anything like it before?
Oh, Isambard.
On a muddy bend of the River Thames, in February 1854, 2,000 workers began construction on Brunel's ocean-going colossus, the Great Eastern. A vessel capable of steaming from England to Australia without recoaling, and in less than half the time of a sailing ship. A ship that could carry 4,000 passengers in peace or 10,000 troops in war. Surely this would be the culmination of Britain's conquest of the sea.
An incredible ship with paddle wheels, with 5 funnels, with a single screw propeller, and with a record of catastrophe and disaster that cannot be equaled. She never made it from the day that she was launched into the Thames sideways and stuck and wouldn't move for weeks, a month. From the day that she hit a storm off the south coast of Ireland, they predicted that she'd never have a rough time because her length was such that it would exceed the longest trough between waves ever recorded on the North Atlantic. Never underestimate the power of the Atlantic. They took the passengers' luggage off in scoops. It was just a slurry in the baggage hold. This great ship tossing about like a cork.
The Great Eastern never made a single voyage to Australia. Beset with financial problems during construction, she was sold. Her new owners placed her on the shorter Atlantic run to New York, where competition was soaring. Her 4,000 berths were never filled. With enormous manpower and fuel costs, she was a financial disaster. After several accidents, Great Eastern was sold again. Her final days spent laying submarine cables across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans.
Finally, before she was scrapped, she ended up as a sort of floating hoarding at Liverpool. They covered her sides with posters. Very ignominious end.
Brunel's dream was never realized, but his vision of giant ocean liners circling the globe unaided and providing the ultimate in comfort for thousands of passengers was merely ahead of its time.
Castles of the Sea is sponsored in part by Lexus. The future of Lexus is here. Fasten your seatbelts. And by Pepsid AC. You could be heartburn-free with Pepsid AC.
Propellers churn the oceans of the world. On ships like the 70,000-ton Oriana, every aspect of life on board revolves around the comfort of passengers. But it's a far cry from the early days of steam. In the mid-19th century, a voyage on a P&O steamer from Britain to a diplomatic posting in India or beyond was a long, tedious affair. Until 1869, a traveler had 2 choices: sail all the way around Cape Horn or take a ship to Alexandria and cross to Suez by camel and then pick up another ship. Whichever way, the only relief from the monotony of shipboard routine was the hopeful congeniality of one's fellow passengers. Without air conditioning and refrigeration, passengers would sit to windward, hoping to escape belching smoke or the smells and noises from the animal pens and slaughterhouse. Of the Suez Canal in 1869 dramatically cut the steaming time from Europe to the east. But the Suez Canal nearly destroyed P&O, one of Great Britain's largest shipping companies. A generous subsidy from the British government had been tied to transporting the mails overland. To keep this much-needed subsidy, shipping lines were forced to unload the mails at one end, dispatch them by rail, and reload them at the other, a slow and ludicrous process. Constructed by the Frenchman Ferdinand de Lesseps, Britain initially feared the Suez Canal would give other maritime nations access to the riches of the East, particularly the French, who controlled the canal. The British government was so concerned, it purchased a major shareholding in the Suez Canal Company in 1876. Rather than threaten Britain's power, the Suez Canal was to strengthen it. A journey from Britain to India that once took up to 2 months by sailing ship was now reduced to a matter of weeks by steamer. The world was indeed shrinking.
There was a pride associated with the conquest of the seas, the command of the seas, and we were by far the dominant naval power militarily and in merchant terms, and there was a great determination that that would not be diminished.
Britain may have dominated the oceans of the world, but by the 1870s, steamships flying the flags of almost every maritime nation were operating regular passenger services around the globe. And the competition encouraged great breakthroughs in design, technology, and passenger comfort. As the final remnants of sail gave way to more powerful steam engines, the traveling public began to equate the number of funnels, rather than masts, with power and speed of passage. It was the Atlantic run to New York that offered the biggest profits, and where an extraordinary race began to own the fastest liners, a race called the Blue Ribbon of the Atlantic.
There's always been a chap who thought he could do better, and in the old days it was doing faster. On the North Atlantic, speed was everything.
Well, to the Home Office, it meant more passengers. There was no greater thrill for the passenger to write home on a postcard regards from the world's fastest ship.
From the earliest days of steam, British lines dominated the Blue Ribbon. On the busiest sea route in the world, their liners had become potent symbols of Britain's seemingly unassailable maritime might. But British supremacy of the waves would soon be challenged by a new and potentially dangerous rival. The German Empire of the late 19th century consisted of 25 independent states that were quickly transformed from a well-ordered agrarian society into a modern industrial nation. Under Kaiser Wilhelm II, Germany expanded its shipbuilding activities with the construction of battleships as well as ocean liners. Less than 20 years after the birth of the new united German nation, the Kaiser embarked on a deliberate course to build an empire to rival Britain. To achieve his aim, he hoped to match his English cousins where they were strongest, on the oceans of the world.
The Kaiser had been to the Fleet Review in 1889 and was very impressed with these British ships, envious. And it was, of course, his old grandmother, Queen Victoria. And he went back to Germany. He said, we've got to have these big ships. Imperial Germany must dominate. Remembering, of course, that at this point, the ocean liner is the supreme mechanical symbol.
With the Kaiser's encouragement, North German Lloyd set about building a series of passenger ships to shake the world. The Kaiser Wilhelm der Große, launched in 1897, was the first in a series of 4 liners over 14,000 tons. Their 4 funnels set a new benchmark in design, and their luxurious interiors were unparalleled on the high seas. On her maiden voyage, Kaiser Wilhelm der Große powered across the Atlantic to New York, snatching the Blue Ribbon from her Cunard rivals. In one spectacular crossing, Germany established itself as a major maritime power.
Just shook the English literally out of their seats. How could they come along with a ship this big? And worse still, she's captured the Blue Ribbon.
To suddenly have an upstart, a place which hadn't even been a country, get together and build 4 stackers. This was a shock to England, a terrible blow, and they had to do something about it.
Almost immediately, a furious competition erupted between Britain and Germany. With Within the year, White Star Line commissioned Belfast shipbuilders Harland and Wolff to build a new flagship, the Oceanic. She was to be 20% larger than her German rival, and at 685 feet, the first ocean liner to exceed the length of Brunel's visionary Great Eastern. Even the German Kaiser was impressed by the ship's beauty, calling her a marvel of perfection in building and fittings. Years later, in 1901, White Star launched the Celtic, an even bigger liner. But at 21,000 tons, she was designed for comfort rather than speed. Germany's hold on the Blue Ribbon would remain unchallenged. In 1901, Queen Victoria died. British monarch for 63 years, her passing marked a dramatic change in British and German relations when her brother ascended the throne. As the British people mourned the end of Queen Victoria's reign, the deep-seated rivalry between Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and his uncle Edward VII entered an ominous, unbridled phase. With a strong merchant fleet, Germany was rapidly building up naval strength, a move which greatly concerned the British Admiralty. The next challenge to Britain's dominance of the sea, however, didn't come from the German Navy, but American money. J.P. Morgan, the railroad tycoon, wanted to expand his railway empire right across the Atlantic, and more importantly, monopolize the entire transatlantic liner trade.
He bought the Red Star Line, he bought the White Star Line, which is one of the cornerstones of England's maritime supremacy. And the British were distressed that in the event of war, they would not be able to take over the White Star Line ships because they weren't British-owned anymore.
At the Cunard Line's Liverpool head office, Morgan's audacity caused a sensation. He wanted to take them over as well. At an emergency board meeting, Cunard decided to lobby the government by playing on the Admiralty's concern of a German challenge. The strategy worked brilliantly. The government not only agreed to prevent the takeover, but to help finance the two biggest ships ever constructed.
So they voted a subsidy to help Cunard build the first ships that were ever called Superliners.
Cunard secured a generous subsidy and a £2.5 million loan from the government to build two giant ships, Mauretania and Lusitania. At nearly 32,000 tons each, they were the largest and fastest ships in the world. Both were to win the blue ribbon of the Atlantic. While built for peace, these two express liners were designed for war. They were powered by enormous turbine engines, and their decks reinforced to take 12 6-inch guns. In these two superliners, Britain also had two high-speed auxiliary cruisers to add to its navy in a potential war with Germany. A war already brewing in the minds of military strategists on both sides.
And there was certainly quite a minority voice in the House of Commons that wasn't terribly happy at the use of public money for really subsidizing a private company. But on the plus side was the clear understanding that those two ships in time of war would be used as auxiliary cruisers.
Cunard, however, was far more interested in profits than war. And from the titled rich to the poorest immigrants, the traveling public loved the four-funneled Cunarders. First-class voyagers preferred the distinction of sailing in such enormous vessels. In 1907, the year the liners went into service. More than 1 million emigrants purchased steerage tickets to America. It was the greatest wave of migration the world had seen, and there were huge profits to be made for the most popular ships. With 2 blue ribbon holders, Cunard now offered the smoothest and fastest passage across the Atlantic, and quickly captured the bulk of the immigrant trade.
The ships were enormously successful, as the fastest ship is always successful on the Atlantic in those days. Whoever could make a crossing in a few hours, less time than the rival, got the cream of the business.
British prestige and morale and power was restored.
British shipbuilding was now at its zenith. In all categories of size, speed, and technology, they had met their German rivals and won, albeit with a little help from the government. Shipbuilding towns and the lives of the workers and their families had always been tied to the fortunes of the yard. As far as they and their employers were concerned, competition was good for business. A great technological race, the most serious in maritime history, was about to begin.